Hello, everybody. Thank you for joining us today. My name is Susan Kudalakis, and I'm Senior Marketing Manager here at Progress. Welcome to our Integrating Data Security and Data Protection into the Enterprise Data Hub webinar. Before we begin, I have a couple of housekeeping slides to show you the webinar control panel and how you can participate. First, to open and hide your control panel, you want to click on the orange highlighted arrow at the top, shown here. There are two options for joining audio. To use VoIP, simply select computer audio under audio, or to dial in using your phone, select phone call and dial in using the numbers and information provided. All lines will be muted for today's session. We'll be taking your questions throughout the presentation. If you have a question at any time, simply submit your question via the questions panel. We do have a full discussion today with limited time for questions. We'll take all your questions asked and get back to listeners after the session if we run out of time. We are recording this session. You'll receive a copy of the recording in the coming days. So let's jump in and quickly introduce you to today's speakers. Our speakers today are Todd Wright and David Lotion. Todd leads global product marketing for Data Direct Solutions from Progress. He works closely with the product management and sales organizations to create and promote materials that are relevant and valuable to Progress customers. He is instrumental in developing customer relationships and creating strategic marketing plans that drive awareness, consideration, education, and demand. David is Principal Consultant of Knowledge Integrity and is recognized worldwide as an information management industry thought leader. He has dedicated years to popularizing best practices for business intelligence, data governance, performance computing, master data management, predictive analytics, and data quality. In addition, he's a lecturer and program director at the University of Maryland College of Information Studies. Before we jump into the discussion, I just want to let everybody know that this is based on the white paper, Integrating Data Security and Data Protection into the Enterprise Data Hub, which is available on progress.com. I'm really excited to have both Todd and David with us today, and I'm going to turn it over to them to start the presentation.
All right, thank you, Susan, very much. And David, of course, it's always great to see you. We've known each other for quite a while, and I think it's pretty interesting that we're still talking about the data protection and data governance topic. And to me, gives me a lot of confidence that organizations are still out there trying to find ways to do really better as far as this practice is concerned. And I really, for this discussion today, wanted to dive in a little bit deeper for our audience about what the paper was all about and some of your thoughts that you had in regard to data governance and protection and security. And to really kick it off, the first thing that piqued my interest is that you had mentioned in your paper that data governance had started as a distinct practice back in the mid-2000s. So we're talking over a decade ago. And I was really curious, what brought this about and why did organizations, let's say 10, 12 years ago, really start to care about data governance? Was it really just the onslaught of data that was starting to hit organizations, or was it a combination of factors?
So thanks for inviting me to chat about this. It is a topic that I have been working on for years and one that continues to evolve. And you're right. I think that, it's interesting because I actually had a conversation with another consultant who claims that data governance was already in place in the late 1990s. I kind of might dispute that. What I remember and recall, and you probably were there around the same time, was that the emergence of data governance as a separate practice, distinct from data quality and distinct from data warehousing. I think it was mid-2000s, same kind of time that other topics like master data management came to play as well. And I think what happened is that the introduction of this concept of an analytical environment and its segregation from a operational or a transaction processing platform, which ushered in this whole concept of the data warehouse as a separate entity and the need for all sorts of different practices and processes for pulling data out of data sources and migrating them into some segregated analytical environment, raised awareness of the fact that there was really a dichotomy between how information was being used for different purposes in an organization. So the original use of computers for doing transaction processing, as long as the objective was to get the transaction processed, so to make the sale or to to move the money out of one account into another account, as long as enough information was collected to be able to execute that transaction, that was satisfactory. But when you start pulling data out and trying to run reports on it or do some kind of analysis or determine whether there's other insights that can be made actionable based on analyzing the data that comes out of those systems, all of a sudden you've got questions about interpretation of data, you've got questions about use of data, you've got questions about the quality of that information. And you, of course, with your background of having worked with, at SAS before that, at Dataflux, that was data quality. The era of data quality, I think, was also around that same time, which was a recognition that the quality and usability of data was not an afterthought of, okay, we've got bad data, now we have to fix it, but rather a recognition that the existence of quote unquote bad data, or really I like to say data that doesn't meet the needs of the data consumers, is a byproduct of processes that are not properly managed and not properly controlled. So if I need the data to have a telephone number and you collect the data but you don't care about the telephone number, that's not the data's problem. It's a process problem. Mm-hmm. And governance, I think, was recognized that if you've got IT governance and you've got other types of governance in an organization, that all of a sudden, if you've got processes that are overseeing the use and collection and management of data, then you also have to govern that, which means that you've got to have standards and policies and protocols and procedures and mechanisms for measuring how well the organization performs according to those things. So I think what happened was the recognition of the failure of the internal processes to adequately satisfy the utility requirements for data across horizontally across the organization, meant that the organization was and when you say the organization, you asked about why the organization started to care about data governance. Mm-hmm. I actually don't think the organization said. I think there were individuals in the organization who suddenly realized that either they were the people using the data and it wasn't meeting their needs, or they were the people who were supporting the people using the data and they were getting a lot of extra work that they were doing over and over again. So I think that's where the mind share started to evolve.
Yeah, pain avoidance is a big motivator to move things forward, which really segues into my next question. While there's a lot of positives about data governance and there's a lot of individuals and organizations that see the good in data governance, you also write that governance also has a negative connotation. And this is really relevant to Data Direct here, implying increased efforts that serves to restrict data access and diminish data usability. I was wondering if you could expand out a little bit about this. Are you still seeing that as prevalent as it was when data governance was first, really taking off as a practice? This is really starting to impact the speed at which I can do my job as opposed to the quality of the data. Are you still seeing that as much? And is there any particular industry where data governance could be seen more of as a hindrance than a help?
So it's interesting that you asked that. I actually I'll pivot for a second, and I'm gonna talk to the topic that's on everybody's tongue, which is generative AI and large language models. And I happened to be perusing my LinkedIn account, and I got a notification that I'm being invited to contribute to an article about to a collective article about data governance. And what I realized what they're doing is, because it seems to be implied in the way that they've structured this, is that they go to some kind of generative AI system and they say what is data governance, or what's the best way to implement the policies for a data governance council, and they get a bunch of paragraphs and then they ask people who are out there to comment on that. And what was interesting is of course, as we all know, that these models are basically based on perusing massive amounts of content, largely, collected from the internet, and then essentially summarized in terms of predictability as to, what's the content that would be generated if we were to be answering a question like that. And so you look at some of the answers to these things, and it literally looks like there is a canned set of procedures that somebody plucked off a bunch of PowerPoint slides. But what's interesting is that when you go to one of these data governance conferences or one of these data management conferences, and you listen to people talk about data governance, they either are doing a use case or they're doing like kind of an introduction to what you need to do for data governance. It's the same thing over and over again. And either it's how do I start a data governance program, excuse me, or how do I socialize it with my managers, or how do I sell it within the organization? And really, those things are really just symptoms of the fact that what you're trying to do is something that people don't want to do. And really that's when we talk about governance having negative connotation, people don't like to be told what to do, especially if there's not a culture of governance within an organization. And most organizations, especially technology organizations, or the technology wing or data wing of a non-data or non-technology organization, they're not used to observing rules. And if you look at development methodologies like Agile is like come up with do something, build something, and make it something that can be tested and used and then tweaked, as opposed to saying here are the constraints under which we have to operate. Make sure that you build this thing that observes those constraints, because people don't like constraints. And so when you start looking at the imposition of lots of different mandates that are coming from external sources into an organization that is not used to being governed, you get a conflict. And an example of that is what seems to be bugging a lot of people now, which is access control as a manifestation of the need to do data protection. So when everybody had full access to all the data, your data scientists, your analysts, they've got self-service that allows them to pluck the data that they need directly from the data warehouse or from the data lake or whatever sources they are able to get access to without any sets of controls. Well, all of a sudden you've got these vulnerabilities that say, well, there things that you are accessing are protected or personal information. And we now have a law in California or in New York or in Colorado that says that you can't use that information unless there is some set of unless the data consumer that is providing the data has opted in to allow that type of analysis to be done. And now that's a constraint. And so that it's difficult to do that because it involves touching a lot of different things. So it involves creating a process for collecting opt-in information. It means managing that data. It means integrating requests for determination of whether an individual has opted into every single access of that data. And so it's much easier to say, well, I'm just going to not let you get that data. So your name, protected information, your location, protected information, anything that can be unique, that can uniquely identify an individual. Well, if I've got a telephone number, that is potentially usable for uniquely identifying an individual. So now all of a sudden I'm going down the list of all the data elements that are in the data warehouse. I'm saying, well, this one you can't use, this one you can't use, this one you can't use. Now, pretty much the only thing that you can use is data that's irrelevant. So now all of a sudden what you're saying is the data analyst or the data scientist, you're being tasked to solve some kind of problem without being able to get access to any of the data that what you would be able to use to do that. And that creates that's a absolute dichotomy within the organization. And so you end up with these scenarios where if I can get access to the data, I'm going to use it. I'm the data analyst. If I can access the data, I'm going to use it. I'll worry about whether I'm supposed to be using it when somebody tells me that I did wrong. And that's violating a bunch of policies. Or you've got the other side, which is the organization's going to really mandate access controls that says you can only get access to this data if under these particular circumstances. And that makes it really difficult to manage because it's fine if I got 30 people in the organization, but if I work for a company that's got 1,000 people or 10,000 or 30,000 people, and now I'm trying to manage or have somebody manage access control privileges for each and every person, knowing that every 6 months somebody changes their role or gets a different set of tasks, that in its own right is an overwhelming barrier to success. So I know that I kind of expanded out a little bit on
No,
that,
it's
but
good.
that's kind of what you asked me to do, which is that really the governance rules are not data rules; they are mandated from some other set of directives under which I have no control as an IT person.
Yep, that's interesting. Everything that you had mentioned there. One of the big things, and I'm not going to go too much into it like a product discussion here about Data Direct, but one of the bigger offerings that is really piqued the interest of our prospects and customers that we have is an offering known as Hybrid Data Pipeline that not only provides data access to organizations for their data sources, but also provides a central hub where an administrator can really, load the data to the correct individuals that should have access to the data. So it's really interesting when I hear your thoughts about that, and also hear about the organizations that are out there that are really looking for those capabilities. And another thing that was really interesting that you had mentioned was the various data privacy laws out there. Colorado, California. Of course, we can't have any discussion about data privacy without the GDPR. And one thing so the GDPR has been around since May of 2018. And one thing that I've heard from customers and I've read quite a bit is how pleasantly surprised organizations were once they really sunk their teeth into a data privacy program or data governance program. And it was something that they were reluctant to do for the longest time. But with GDPR, they were forced to do so to meet the compliance and do business in EMEA. I was, you have extensive conversations with people, organizations out in the field, either conferences or one-on-one calls. I was wondering, what were some of the pleasant surprises that you've heard about all the regulations around data privacy and how that might have enabled the business beyond just hitting this stringent compliance goal, but also helped with their analytics or their BI and so forth. What if you had any thoughts on that?
Yeah, I'll go back to something that I said before, and it's none of those things that you just said, but rather it is that when like Rahm Emanuel, who was in Obama's administration, then later was the mayor of Chicago. One of the things and I'll paraphrasing what he said never let a good crisis go to waste. And that is kind of what we can talk about with something like GDPR, because what it was is a mandate that basically said, either be willing to risk being fined for violating this law, or figure out how to comply with it. And some organizations don't, they just didn't care. I mean, if you look at some of these big companies, they were fined millions, billions of dollars. But really what it did is it gave the people who've been advocating on behalf of introducing some kind of governance into the organization suddenly have a hammer that somebody's wielding that says, we actually have to do something. And so in organizations that are a little forward thinking, of course, you've always got the reactionary companies that are just going to say, oh, what are we going to do? Let's go buy a product. And that is claims to do data protection, and now we're good, but without realizing that data protection is really more about policies. It's not about a tool. However, I think that the flip side of that is that when you start recognizing, and I think that this is one of the things that I saw in conversations with people, is that all of a sudden it's no longer about, a data policy is no longer a very high level description of some kind of warm and fuzzy mandate about data use in the organization, like all people are responsible for data quality. I mean, that's very aspirational and also impossible to implement. But really, it then changes the conversation from being a policy about data is not a global warm and fuzzy. It is a discrete assertion of some measurable thing that needs to be complied with. And so something like GDPR, and I've read GDPR, and I don't presume to be an expert in the interpretation of these rules or these laws, or even very adept at reading the language. But it's a very colorful document, in its own way, in that it just not only describes a lot of where the constraints are, but also where the relaxations are to those constraints. And what it does is it gives you this opportunity to really think about, what is the intent of a policy, and where does it kind of fall down, and what's the boundary to which the organization is accountable for enforcing some aspect of that. So I'll give a real quick, example. It's a contrived example, but and again, I'm paraphrasing because a bunch of these different laws that are modeled on GDPR also say some very similar things. And I'll, referring back to this whole concept of opt-in or opt-out. So the basic idea is, if I'm a data subject, somebody for whom a company is collecting data, I can opt in or opt out of allowing that company to make use of my data for some set of purposes, whether it's for analytical purposes or whether it's for data sharing. So, the canonical example would be, I'm the telephone company and I'm sharing information about somebody opening up a business telephone line account with a company that does business cards. Okay, very simple example. I could sell that information to the business card company, because then they can go and they can solicit those new business accounts to sign up for business cards. Okay, so very simple example. And if I'm the data subject, I can just say, well, I'm opting out of that, so you can't sell that. Well, what that says is that there's a policy about monitoring, managing. It digs right into your application architecture. So it's not just a data thing. It's saying that before I share data, I have to check some box to see whether the individuals whose data I'm sharing is being, has opted in or opted out. Mm-hmm. Now, that being said, there are other scenarios in which, though, the opt-in or opt-out is irrelevant. So, for example, if I were, one scenario is you can't opt out of a company's using the personal data for the purposes for which the business transaction is being performed. Okay. Mm-hmm. So I'm paraphrasing this because it shows up in a little bit different language in different places. But basically, it's like, if I order something, if I order a telephone account from a telecommunications company, but then I say, but you can't use my telephone number for any purposes, they are still allowed to take your telephone number and assign it to the wires that are going into your wall, right? So that's a use of that data, even though it's not it's using that, and it's uniquely identifying that entity. But because it is part of the contract of doing business with the company, they're allowed to use it whether you say they are or not. And so there's a lot of these different scenarios, and now all of a sudden it forces engineers and application developers and data architects and to work with legal and compliance and the interpretation of content that then has direct consequences in terms of architecture and design. So, as a pleasant surprise, what that basically says is that it subtly integrates into the development process the need to understand who the consumers are and who the users are of the system, and what the constraints are from the business perspective, instead of just thinking, okay, well, I need to execute a transaction and here's how that transaction gets executed.
That's interesting that you talked about different departments. I remember actually the organization that I worked for back in 2018. Um, and it was the compliance for GDPR wasn't led by IT. It was led by the legal department, and in a big extent or big part of it as well was the HR department to make sure that it was socialized throughout the whole organization as far as what are the do's and don'ts and the laws around that. So it's pretty interesting that you say that towards the end. Shifting gears a tiny bit, you had talked about in your paper the ongoing. I'll have to paraphrase on this because I'm reading from your paper here. The ongoing transformation organizations are going through regarding the move from premises data storage to a multi-cloud environment. And you stated that organizations, and I quote, organizations transitioning from an exclusive on-premises data center oriented data platform must consider how the evolving hybrid multi-cloud data environments can further compound systemic complexity. Considering many of the people listening today are concerned with data governance as it relates to data access and connectivity, which we do here at Data Direct, I was wondering if you could put some, added thoughts to that as it relates to accessing your data sources. Really moving from what you had mentioned, the on-premises, to a more of not only a cloud environment, but both on-premises and cloud, multi-cloud environment. What are some of the? And I know you had touched on this, but what are some of the unique challenges and ways organizations can tackle the reality of today?
So my first reaction is that when you read back what I actually said in the paper, it astounds me how many multisyllabic words I can throw into a single sentence at one time.
You're very smart guy.
Well, or maybe I'm just trying to add additional complexity, systemic complexity. I think what you're asking is really a fundamental question, which is that when everything is sitting in one place, it's easy to manage that. But with and I'm sure you've seen a lot of the media hype about different data organizations, data formats, and let's all this concept of data mesh and data fabric and all these terms. The underlying motivation there is that as I have an organization that has less reduced systemic centralization as different lines of business are opting to migrate their application and data to cloud service providers, you now are getting this distributed environment where I've got corporate information assets that are no longer centralized as a single thing. So I used to have, maybe on-prem, I would have an accounting system and a sales system, a marketing system, and customer support system. So yeah, I've got distributed systems, but they're all inside the same firewall. And if I want to build a customer data platform, I know where all the customer data is, and despite all the, and that this is a subject for, a bunch of other conversations, but, despite all the complexity in merging customer data that's coming from multiple sources inside an organization's on-premises infrastructure, at least I know that I can get some visibility into what a customer is and what customer data exists, because it's being pulled from a limited scope of content, right? But now I've got an organization that the marketing organization is outsourcing some of their data management to software as a service like Marketo or something like that, and Salesforce is being used by the salespeople, and so now we've got these software as a service systems where the control of the application is outside the administrative domain. It's not sitting on-prem. The data is sitting out there. I'll even raise that question as to, yes, it is enterprise data, but it's being held hostage somewhat in somebody else's system. And if you happen to opt for one of these software as a service providers who make it really difficult for you to get access to data that is other than the way that they want you to get to it. It literally is being held hostage. So that's one data point. But then if I'm got there's smart people in every group, and like I've worked with companies or organizations, government agencies, where there's lots of smart people who are coming in who think that they know the best way to do things, and they say, okay, well, we're going to move to Hadoop, and three doors down, there's another group where they're moving things to AWS to blob storage or object storage, and then across the hall they're going to Azure, and they're going to the Azure's version of object storage. And now, this other group, they want to impose a Hive structure on top of their object storage, and then somebody else is putting it into, they're doing a lift and shift of their Oracle system. So they're implementing Oracle on an instance. And all of a sudden you've got all these different footprints of data that used to all be within the same, at least within the same building, maybe, or on the same floor or same room or same computer. But now it's not in the same computer, it's not on the same floor, not even in the same building, not even be in the same region. And there's less coordination. So, we talked before about the need for governance. I mean, this is where we start seeing an increased need for more governance. But if I want to get access to information about a customer or a product or a part, where am I going, right? I mean, where do I go to? I don't know where that data is. So there's two aspects to this. One is knowing where the data is, and the other is getting access to it. And I think you were asking the question about data access and connectivity and complexity. I mean, really, what we want to do is acknowledge that there is increased complexity there, and that if I want to get customer data, it's no longer as easy as running a query against the data warehouse or the customer data platform, but rather there's customer data sitting in Marketo, and there's customer data sitting in AWS and S3, and there's customer data in the Oracle system that's being run on the IBM system, and there's customer data that's sitting in MySQL that's being run in Google Cloud, and if I want to get information about customers, I've got to be able to get access to all those different sources. And then the one last complexity is that I'm not limiting myself anymore, or the organization anymore, to just data that's within our administrative control, but rather, the Census Bureau collects a lot of information about people, and there's no reason why I can't integrate that information to get some kind of statistical characteristics of demographics associated with people living in a particular location. So I'm going to pull data in from this government site, or this real estate transactions from the state, or information about particular types of sales that take place within some region, or data that's coming from a trading partner, or we've got organizations that are willing to allow a third party to create like a clean room where they can share data. Or I've got a data stream that's like a news stream, and I've got some kind of, also some kind of mechanism that is doing entity identification within news streams to determine whether people are being talked about in the news, and tagging that content and getting unstructured content. So now all of a sudden I've got all these different sources, and yet you want to empower your data consumers, but now you're going to ask them that you have to learn how to get access to Oracle and Snowflake and DB2 and MySQL and Postgres, and write this code in Python and use JDBC from your Java program, and use GraphQL and some other mechanism. And now there's a data feed that's coming in from the National News Service, and there's the weather feed, and there's all these sensors. The explosion of data sources is it's incredible, and being able to get access to that, you're never going to be able to get your data analysts or your citizen data scientists to be experts in how to write a query that can then be pushed out to two Oracle systems, and one request out of Snowflake and one out of Salesforce. So you need to have some kind of mechanism that will provide that service or those services and do it in a way that I'll use the word opaque. I mean, this is one of those situations where the word transparent and opaque seem to they're antonyms, but they seem to mean the same thing. Structurally, what we're really saying is the data user doesn't need to know. They want to say, get me customer data and let the system figure it out. Mm-hmm. And that's where we need to have better connectivity mechanisms.
Yep, completely agree. Which is really interesting because what you just described is a lot of complexity within organizations. But you also mentioned within your paper, getting towards the end, was a lot of ad hoc data governance that is going on. And you say the root cause issues by ad hoc data governance is the assumption that data protection only needs to be applied when the data is delivered. Sounds very reactive as opposed to proactive. So my question is there still a large amount of organizations that are out there that are still in 2023 still taking an ad hoc approach to data governance, even with all the data privacy laws that we had discussed earlier, both in the United States and MIA and others? Are you still seeing that, or is that kind of shifting more?
I think, sometimes some of these questions are sensitive questions, right? Because you're asking about how organizations are managing, data protection, and and the presumed ad hoc approach is, I'm going to set up some kind of systemic barrier that is meant to prevent external people from getting in to the system, right? Or I'm going to put some kind of masking on the data that is being returned from a query. But there's between those two places, there's a lot of space for bad stuff to happen. And we don't always know how we're keeping people or how well we're doing at keeping people out, because we don't know until we discover that that's happened, so if, and not only that, we've also got people who are inside, who are insider threats, like that person who we did some work for a healthcare organization, and they have to mention that there was some guy who was fired because he was looking up to see, it was out in California somewhere, and they were looking to see what celebrities were in the hospital so they could sell that information to news people, right? So that's a good example of an insider threat. I mean, the real question there is that, like when I do a talk on data protection or data policy governance, I will often poll the audience and I will ask the question, how many of you work for an organization that's experienced a data breach? And then, a bunch of people put their hands up. And then I'll say, okay, well, how many of you work for an organization that hasn't realized that it's experienced a data breach? And everybody laughs, but it's true. I mean, we don't know where the vulnerabilities are and when they are being exploited. And so the fact is that you open up the paper and yet there is another article about some hospital that's been succumbs to some kind of what's it called, like ransomware, or a massive data breach, or you get a notification from this happened the other day. I get a notification from my credit monitoring. They also do identity monitoring, and like, oh, your information has been found on the dark web. So the fact is that it's not unreasonable to believe that, since data governance is largely an afterthought anyway in most organizations, and that required, like again, I'll go back to what I was saying before about these crowdsourced AI generated articles. One of the articles was saying, the question that it was trying to answer is, how do I convince my boss that data governance is important? And my response to that is if you are telling your boss that data governance is important, you got bigger problems than just not having data governance, because clearly you're if you have to explain to your manager the benefits of having good practices and protocols and oversight, then it's a misguided organization at best and dysfunctional at worst. So I think what's interesting is that data governance is a set of practices, and being able to integrate those practices into the organization the same way we have it for systemic governance or IT governance. When it used to be you start working at some place and they would put a computer on your desk and a telephone, and you lift up the receiver of the telephone and there's a dial tone, and it's just expected that that's going to happen. And the same thing should be in place for data utility. That if I can, if I go to a mechanism by which I can get access to the data, then it's dial tone, right? It works the way it's supposed to work, and my expectation should be that's what it should be, and all the underlying things that make that work, that should be engineered into the system.
Yep, exactly. So, moving on from that, and be the final question here for you, David. And it's probably one of my favorite questions I like to ask you. It's probably not your favorite question, but to predict the future, where do you see all of this going as far as data privacy? Any additional laws that you, in your opinion, do you see coming in the future? Maybe even a federal law, and data governance as a whole. Where do you potentially see that going? And just to put some data direct in there, how should organizations and any individuals that are listening today, what further considerations should they have around data connectivity and data access as it really pertains to governance and privacy as we move further out from 2023 and into the future?
So what's great about your final question is that I think there's 4 questions there. So
there was.
So I'm gonna try to address each one of them. So the first thing is about the data privacy environment, and I think that we are getting more and more democratized understanding of what data privacy really means. And I'm going to look backwards so I can talk about the future. I mean, in the past, we have been, we as a collective society have been so enamored of our technology that we neglect to understand the risks of and the terms under which the technology is being used. And to quote, I don't know who I'm quoting here, but there's this comment that if you don't know what the product is, so when it comes to something like free email or some other kind of free service, if you don't know what the product is, you're it. And if you look at this, it's like it is handed over in spades at this point, because and I'm going to put my academic hat on and just say that I don't think people even realize the extent to which life has changed, because it's been a subtle change over time. But everything we do now is driven by data. Mm-hmm. So when news, your media outlets, which used to be trusted sources of unbiased information, you end up with a court case where a major quote unquote news organization admits that they're an entertainment business, not a news business. And if you go to Google News, for example, which is an aggregator, Google News is producing content or aggregating content based on what they think you want to see. So if I go to Google News and I look at the headlines, and Todd goes to Google News and looks at the headlines, those might not even be the same thing. And in fact, everything we see, where we take for granted that it just is all micromanaged by data. So I go to Netflix and I get a different set of recommendations than Todd does. And maybe Todd and I both are recommended to watch some kind of horror movie. The graphic, or the image that is on the thumbnail that Todd sees or that you see, it may be different than the one that I see. And it's all got an underlying intent, which is there is some some motivation of the organization that is presenting information to you to influence your opinion and the way that you think and the things that you do as a byproduct of your opinions, and trying to get those aligned with what their objectives are. So if you go to Netflix, Netflix wants you to keep watching Netflix. And if you go to Apple TV Plus wants you to keep watching Apple TV Plus. And, Amazon Prime Video might want you to watch Amazon Prime Video, but they're also trying to sell you, rental or sales of content that you don't have, you don't pay for content on Netflix, you're a subscriber. So they all have different intents. And so when it comes to this whole question of privacy is balancing what am I as an individual, am I willing to tolerate in terms of exploitation of my personal information? And you see this kind of distinction in different data privacy laws. So if you go to the Virginia law talks about your very general personal information is information that, and again, I'm paraphrasing, information that can be used to uniquely identify an individual. While in the California, the CCPA, California Consumer Privacy Act, and then there's a follow-on. They actually have already revised that. They have a whole enumeration of different types of information that is personal information, including your browser history or your search history. That's a lot different. It's much more explicit, but it's much different than what the Virginia law says. So you asked about expansion of further laws or a federal law. The way the United States is organized, you can still have a federal law and you can have state laws, and they don't have to necessarily coincide, and they might have different constraints and different expectations. So yeah, I do recall that there was some discussion of a data privacy law in Congress. I don't know where that is at this point. I know that lots of different countries have data privacy laws. I know that a lot of them are slightly different from others, enough to make that, we talked about complexity. Well, that in its own right creates a huge amount of complexity, because something that I can do with a customer's data under the California law is not allowed. I can't do it under the GDPR, or maybe there's something I can do with the Colorado data that I can't, that I'm not allowed to do with California data. Or even a California resident who is on vacation in Colorado might have that data be subject to the Colorado law and not the California law. But if that same individual was at home in San Francisco, the same transaction, the same company, everything's the same except for the location, is now subject to California law and not Colorado law. So now all of a sudden, data constraints and policies are not just associated with the data; they're associated with the context in which the data is being collected, including who's doing it and what time they're doing it and where they're doing it. Right. So now all of a sudden in terms of opportunities as a data governance practitioner and consultant, I'm very optimistic that there's going to be lots and lots of work to do because of how difficult this is. Now, that being said, I think that having a good data connectivity strategy is going to be critical to an organization to be able to manage this. Because if I've got 100 different data privacy laws that I've got to be able to accommodate, and each one of them has different constraints about the context under which the data is being collected, used, and managed and shared, that means there's a lot of data policies that have to be managed, and I can't expect that everybody's going to be in control of that. So we need to automate a lot of that. So automating that means that I've got to automate my policy management and policy governance, and I've got to be able to embed that within my data connectivity. So I want to push governance to be engineered into the data fabric, and that means that I've got to be able to take my policies and implement them at the point where data is coming into the organization. And data connectivity, especially, you made reference to Data Direct. So Data Direct, one example of one of the things that it does is it gives you, connectors to a lot of different data sources. Well, what I want to be able to do is leverage that capability to be able to push compliance all the way to the point of acquisition. And if I can do that, then I've got some mechanism for auditability of compliance with these laws, which puts me in a competitive advantage, because my organization, which has has managed my data policy and governed my compliance is in a better position to be able to advocate to my customers that we are protecting their data, which then becomes a competitive advantage. So I think there's lots of opportunities for where governance all of a sudden is becoming not just a thing that I have to do because somebody else told me to do it, but rather I get two different facets of this, right? One is what we talked about before, which is instead of restricting access, we're empowering data users. And the other is we're turning it into some kind of monetization mechanism, which is we can get value out of the use of governance to this, to socialize our responsibility to our customers in the market.
Mm-hmm. Yep, exactly. Well, David, this was, as always, a great discussion coming from your great paper. I know that we talked a lot today. Is there any final thoughts before we close this out? I know it's a broad question to always ask a final thought, but if there's anything that you want our viewers today to go home with or go back to work with, is there anything in particular that?
Yeah, I'm going to throw out a question, which is something, again, like I'm going to refer back to, the thing that's on everybody's tongue, the tip of everybody's tongue, which is ChatGPT and generative AI. I recently asked a question on LinkedIn about intellectual property associated with content that was generated by a generative AI system. But I'm going to spin it around. I'm going to talk a little bit about or ask this question about the data that's being used, which is that we've got governance and we've got data protections, and we've got assertions of controls over use for people. But now I've got these AI systems that are, they're not people, but lots of people think they're like people. And now we have to have, two questions. The first question is, how do we assert controls over these artificial intelligent systems or models for enforcing controls associated with data use? Because they're not sharing data; they're just using it to learn. But on the other hand, the second half of this is, how do we assert governance control over the outputs of these large language models? Meaning that if it was able to use personal information to build, to do training, is it violating some set of constraints or laws or other types of directives to be using that information to generate output? So maybe that's a topic of another conversation. But I think that in the world of data governance and data security and data protection, these are new questions that when we first talked about the topic of this paper, that wasn't even on anybody's mind. And so I would welcome anybody to reach out to us to ask questions about those types of things. I think there's lots of opportunity for trying to figure out how to solve that problem.
Well, David, I think it's a great way to end this on the ChatGPT subject. Everyone is, of course, talking about that. Has become quite the mainstream topic. With that, I thank everyone for their time today, especially you, David. And while we don't have any time for questions at this point here at Progress Data Direct, we're more than happy to take your questions afterwards, and we'll have someone get in touch with you shortly. And with that said, I wish everyone a great day. Thank you very much.
Yeah, thanks, Todd. I appreciate you guys giving me the opportunity to chat, and I hope if anybody has questions about the topic or the paper, that they'll reach out.
Absolutely. Thank you again. Bye-bye.
All right, thanks.